Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is lecture number this is lecture number 12 on discourse analysis, and this lecture is the continuation of socio-symbolic function of language that we have discussed in our previous lecture. So in our previous lecture we have discussed the overview of the topic and sign, symbol, symptom, language and group, methodology of empiric social act research, transitory social acts. In today's lecture, we would discuss sociogrammar, non-reductional sociogrammar, language and prestige. Students, to continue the previous lecture, I am going to discuss the overview that we have discussed in our previous lecture. Students, these two discussions start from the premise known since antiquity that speech indicates something of the speaker. Language as action is regarded not only as a medium to convey lexical or semantic information, but also of social meanings. Students, this raises the question, how can we get access to the social meaning of the linguistic structures? This is the main question dealt with throughout this lecture. It sets out with carefully defining the notion of symbolic meaning on the grounds of social semiotics. Students, it then develops the sociological concept of group or community as a cultural subsystem of society in order to understand better the relationship between language variation as options of linguistic choice and social act as a group-specific linguistic variety. Students, within this conceptual framework, the contours of a sociogrammar are outlined, which describes the socio-symbolic functions of phonetic, prosodic, morphological, lexical, syntactical, textual, and pragmatic elements of linguistic structure. Students, the perspective then broadens to the level of discourse on which the relationship of language and prestige, or language and power, is dealt with. Students, the question about the social symbolic function of language opens up a huge variety of research perspectives for language description. Independent studies on the various possibilities of social markedness of linguistic and extra-linguistic science are compelled to supply the foundation for a kind of social grammar. Claims the need for such a construction as an addition to literature-oriented standard grammar and the skill to be produced standard grammar of spoken language. Students, Kant dialect grammars could be a model for a description of the subsystem in the German language. However, a socio-semiotic perspective carries us beyond the field of a single language and could provide a basis for the development of variety grammars adequate to the description of language in its situational and social application. Students, British contextualism, for example, has out of scientific, theoretical and historic reasons made a considerable advance in the development of this perspective of language as an organizational form of social experiences. Students, there are propositions for a socio-semiotic basis of linguistic description of language variation in the overlapping sections of the scientific fields of language, social, text, media, and communication studies. Students, they are able to create a scientifically compatible relation between sociologic, communicative conditions of dialogic actions as are manifested in the structure of communicative settings, be this in everyday conversation, theoretical discourse, or literary dialogue, with text semiotic conditions of communicative negotiation. Students, the characteristics of the better negotiation in everyday and static semiotic processes are specified and analyzed in terms of their media theoretical and text line and text linguistic aspects. This dialogue linguistic model, obtained from the textual comparison of social and semiotic conditions of communication, offers a sufficiently theoretical frame for the examination of regular variants with social group oriented and interactional markers on all levels of linguistic description, including non-verbal and paraverbal features. Students, sign involving mimic, gestural, proxemic, sodic, vocal, tonic, chromic, or stromic features must be included in a non-reductional sociogrammar because they can attain a prominently socio-symbolic meaning in both directly and technically transmitted forms of communication as well as in literary notation. Students, these signs can be applied for the definition of certain communicative settings as being asymmetric, for the assessment of the communicative partner on the grounds of paraverbal manifestations of his emotional state, for the interpretation of intermediary relationship in discrepancies between verbal and non-verbal messages, and for the indication of individual, social, ethnical, and gender-connected identity of the communicative partner. Students, a sociogrammar must further be able to provide a basis for reflection on conflict potential that can arise from the violation of rules for non-verbal and paraverbal dialogue handling, or from the unawareness of inter-ethnic differences in non-verbal and paraverbal communication. Students, the socio-symbolic importance of these non-strictly grammatical but more language-oriented markers has presently been acknowledged in connection with studies on code switching and also in the area of language teaching. They have also been more detailed insights in terms of the systematic integration of pragmatic and textual levels. Students, the socio-symbolic relevance for the definition and classification, that is, of categorization of texts, conversational types, linguistic styles, and registers were originally not accounted for in traditional grammars. Students, further, there was no sufficient investigation of socio-semiotic meaning of zenisms on all levels of linguistic description, that is of pragmatic zenisms, that is in the studies of linguistic politeness and of idiomatic, lexical, syntactical, morphological, and phonological imports of foreign languages. Students, empiric analysis such as the study on social sensitivity to style in specific groups of speakers, supplying groundwork for the development of sociosemantics. Students, individual variation in the structuring of semantic fields within a certain language further necessitates a contrasted socio-semantics for the description of differences in linguistic processes of truth, perception, and organization of knowledge. Students, further feature worth mentioning are the more subtle possibilities of distinction in the social and situational use of modal particles, as well as the possibilities to these features and the relations to social order. Students, only the knowledge about the basic structure of orientation allows him to link their social, symbolic, and social cultural adoption in communication practices. In German, socio-symbolic markers on a morphological and syntactic level are less perceptible, yet clearly identifiable. Students, during the discussion on language barriers, German sociolinguists adopt as a starting point the hypothesis of class-specific syntactic rules, which, however, empirically varied rather to be rules on media. Not all syntactic varieties can be explained by media-specific and situational conditions. These particular sociolectal applications would have to be described in a socio-syntactic model. The same applies for morphological variations of pronoun systems, forms of address, case systems, and gender. Students, reductions in the form, content of the temporal and numeric markers are not always explicable in phonetic and dialectic grammatical abundances of examples, but it is necessary to distinguish whether they carry social meaning in the sense of denotative references to morphologically represented facts, or whether they are pragmatic indicators for connotative association of social deactive hints about the speaker or group of speakers. Students, written language is also a social symbol beyond its communicative, codified, and normed function. It is the symbol of a culture, an expression of national culture and subcultural identity of social groups, peoples, religious communities, minorities, internet subcultures of a sometimes considerable political nature. Students, it is even possible that the speaker thus is forced with social sanctions induced by the fact that his quiet and automatically applied form of phonetic speech realization marks him as a specific social subject. Students, the analysis of stigmatized articulations and intonation, the inventory systematic differentiation between allophonic variants and sociophonic and sociophonetic variables, the socio-stylistic categorization of articulation levels from very formal to slang and colloquial speech, and these are of immeasurable value also for the applied dimensions of the study of language use, language criticism, language teaching, and language education, both in terms of first language and foreign language education. Students, the linguistic distinction between, that is, the examination of sounds as elements of phonemic systems on the one hand and sounds as carriers of social symbolic functions on the other, with its language, theoretical intention, and references to all levels of language, increases the awareness of what Rolf Fasold emphasized in critical disjointing from common grammatical description in systematic linguistics. Students, the recent observation of language on the discourse level has obtained a higher effect than studies on the classical levels of linguistic description. It is commonly argued that where intelligibility is not in question, language differences serve primarily to mark social identity and are perpetuated in accordance with established norms and traditions. Students, however, the allocation of prestige in language use is not a new phenomenon. In Western European culture, there is a high variances of prestige and closeness to standard, and also of variety and formality of the communicative situation as a congruent pattern of socially competent speakers. Students, today as much as ever, public discourse such as in politics, the media, economy, education and science is not simply about communication but horrible about power. The whole arsenal of the antique was practically dedicated to the objective to convince the opposite party. The ambivalent maxim of persuaders always contained both to convince with the battle argument and to persuade or win someone over with the rhetorically more ingenious strategy. If prestige is linguistically used in order to deceive others about one's objectives, one's competence and one's status, the expression prestige almost returned to its original meaning. Students, under the influence of personal and social cognition, the socio-symbolic function of language in discourse increases equally to the socio-symbolic function of status insignia in society. Students, those holding power in discourse determine the nature and duration of a conversation and distribution of turns. They are able to manipulate the conversational pattern, that is, in proposing political advertising as a dialogue with the public. Further, they are in position to convey ideologies and representation of the truth, called the power of inducing others to adopt one's own construction of the truth, the symbolic power of language. This power is part of categories that are central for the distinction of social differences. Students, at least this is what can be deduced from a number of dispersed hints about language. Students, this distinction is just as practical as it is partial with its description of the vivid and colorful language of the workers on the one hand and the dull and barren language of the bourgeois on the other. It very much invokes Bernstein's account of the restricted codes of the working class and the elaborated codes of the middle class. But differently to Bernstein, who argued that compensatory language education would obtain an emancipatory force of comprehending one's own social situation by linguistically bringing it to the point. Okay, students, you may ask any question in our class on Saturday about the lecture. See you in next class.